recording, and I will admit all. Morning, Bryn. Morning, Barry. Morning, Derek. Morning, everybody. Morning, Peter. Morning, Lorna. Thanks for joining. Morning, Con.
Morning.
Good to see you all. Thanks for joining, Bryn. If you've just joined, if you could mute, please, that would be great. And we can try and cut out any background noise. That'd be good. So that'd be good. So yeah, Con, I'm just going to mute you if you can, or you can mute yourself. Thanks, Con. Brilliant. I'll monitor the lobby as usual. For some reason, I think the Playpen site was down this morning, so there might be a few latecomers, but thanks everyone for joining. Okay, I think we're virtually there, virtually ready. As I say, thanks everyone for joining this morning's coffee morning. This week we're talking about the hot potato that is DB surplus changes proposed by Rachel Reeves. And last year's very kindly gone into the snake pit to present her thoughts. I'm sure there's, as usual on Playpen, we like to keep things open. So if you want to ask a question, raise a hand. Obviously, we'll monitor the chat room as well. This is being recorded, so Con, Derek, everybody, thumbs up for being recorded. Thank you very much indeed. And the slideshow, I'm assuming last year we can send the slideshow out later on if anybody wants it.
Yes, happy for that, yeah.
Fine, perfect, okay. So without any further ado, I'll pass on to you and thank you in advance for your presentation, and should be a good session. So over to you, Lascia.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. And hello, everyone. Really great to be here today and to meet you all. And hopefully we can get into a good heated discussion about this topic. So just to introduce myself, I'm Lascia. I am a director at Pensions for Purpose. In case any of you are not familiar with Pensions for Purpose, we work to bring people across the pensions industry together to drive forward positive outcomes for all pension scheme members, for society more generally, and for the planet. Now, when Steve actually reached out to us, to Pensions for Purpose originally, about doing a session for today, we weren't planning to talk about DB surplus because it was before all these announcements came out. So we were originally thinking we'd have sort of a totally different focus. We'd talk about pooling and collaboration and sort of everything that's been going on in LGPS and DC world. But as Steve said, you know, the hot potato at the moment has very much been DB surplus, and that's really dominated headlines over the past couple of weeks. So we decided it would make sense to change the topic a little bit last minute and talk about that today. So I've got some slides there. They're fairly basic, but I'll talk through those. But please do, as Steve said, you know, jump in with any comments or questions or thoughts, and we'll have a good discussion. So what I was planning to cover today is start with just a bit of a timeline of what's happened so far and what's actually been announced in terms of DB surplus and DB pensions. Then I thought we could have a bit of a chat about DB surplus and how it can best be used, but also about how the changes in the surplus regime could change the way that DB schemes invest. I think we can't be talking about this topic without talking about how we protect members. So we'll definitely discuss that. And then finally, I wanted to finish by just talking a bit about how this all fits in with the broader pensions and policy landscape. So let's start with a bit of a timeline. So really the big announcements about the use of DB and DB surpluses all kicked off about a year and a half ago, July 2023, at Jeremy Hunt's Mansion House speech. So previous government, previous chancellor. And this speech really noted that there was an opportunity to unlock DB pensions, so to make surpluses more readily accessible and therefore change the way that the kind of £1 trillion+ of money sitting in DB pensions are invested. Now, on the back of this speech, there was a fairly high-level call for evidence about DB pension schemes that was issued. And then in November 2023, we had the autumn statement. So again, still got the Conservative government. That was with Jeremy Hunt. And as part of this, he talked a bit about DB pensions, but also talked about some other stuff. And one of the big changes that came out of that was an announcement about the tax on surplus. So he announced that there would be a change to surplus tax, and this is on surplus relative to a buyout basis, from 35% to 25%. He also noted that they'd be opening another consultation, a more detailed consultation on options for DB schemes, and that this would be issued in the winter. So the winter ended up being February 2024. So that's when the government issued its consultation with more detail on options for DB pension schemes. But we haven't yet had a response to that consultation. Because obviously another big thing happened last year with the government, which was July 2024, general election and a new government in power. Now, I think one thing that's worth noting is that kind of all these proposals around unlocking DB pensions have had pretty strong bipartisan support across both Labour and the Conservatives. And this isn't really that surprising to me, because I think from the perspective of a government, they see this as a way to generate growth, to access money without necessarily having to raise taxes or, income taxes for their voters. So they perhaps see it as sort of an easy win, regardless of which party they stand for. So changing government kind of doesn't stop this from being the agenda, but it maybe slows it down a little bit. And actually, a lot of what we've been hearing from the Labour government until this January announcement was more around LGPS pensions and DC pensions. And it almost felt as though, the corporate DB schemes were taking a bit of a back seat. But then we had the big announcements that came out last week, a couple of weeks after the consultations for LGPS and DC schemes closed. The government then issued their press release saying there'll be changes to the rules around DB pension surplus. So I think everybody in the industry is now sort of wondering, what will the changes be? What's the detail underlying all of this? And we don't know yet. So hopefully some people in government have an idea of what that detail is, but that hasn't been announced yet. So the government has said that in the spring this year, they'll be publishing more detailed responses to the 2024 consultation. And we're hoping we're going to get all this detail then. I think we can all have our bets on what we actually think the government mean by spring. My guess is May, because I feel like once you get into June, that's definitely not spring anymore. But, all bets are on for that one. That's sort of the timeline of how we got here and how sort of government started getting involved in this. I think another big question to ask is why we got here, and why the government decided to be so interested in DB pensions. And I think the obvious starting point is just how much money there is there. So TPR's the pension regulator, they've done some calculations as at 30th September 2024. And based on those calculations, the total assets under management of corporate DB pensions was £1.24 trillion. And that is just a huge amount of money. I mean, to put it into context, it's about half of what the total GDP of the whole of the UK was in 2023. So I think government might kind of see this massive number and just think, how can we get in on that a little bit? And the other point is, it's not just that there's a lot of AUM there. A lot of those schemes are also sitting in a surplus. So again, according to the pension regulator's analysis, 75% of DB schemes are currently sitting in a surplus on a low dependency basis. So by low dependency, they're talking about a gilts plus 0.5% basis, rather than the kind of buyout basis that's often quoted. This surplus is worth a total of £160 billion. So again, that's not sort of any small amount of money. That's a lot of money that people are thinking about. So the next big questions. Oh, I can see a comment on there. These TPR surplus stats are highly suspicious. That is overstated. I don't know, Elspeth, if you want to share any more on that. Those are sort of directly quoted from that website, but very happy to hear your views on why those stats are so suspicious.
Yeah, actually, it's Con Keating. Just I'm using Elspeth's computer again today.
Oh, sorry.
That's all right. Don't worry about it. Most of the others on here are familiar. Basically, TPR is still, even after the revisions that they made to assets and liabilities earlier this year, TPR are still overstating the assets held by schemes relative to the survey which is produced by the ONS. In fact, The asset number that TPR have, which I think you've got there correctly, is 1240. The PPF number is, and there's no reason for the PPF asset number to be materially different from TPR, is 79 billion lower than that. And when we see the ONS number, we can expect that to come in a little bit below, maybe 5%, so another 30 or 40 billion below the PPF number. So we've got assets overstated by a material amount by the pensions regulator. And the pensions regulator did something else in their revision to the data, which is that they dropped the value of the amount of liabilities, their estimate of liabilities, by 140 billion pounds, which, when you consider the numbers are around 1.2, 1.3, is really a huge decrease. And that is fundamentally done without any rationale or justification. The net effect is that Ian and I produced a paper which Henry published as a blog yesterday, but I'll quote you a few figures of surplus. TPR surplus of schemes in surplus is 223 billion. The number, when we adjust for 79 billion of overstatement of assets and 70 billion of liabilities, becomes 116. That's relative to TP's. When you look at low dependency, TPR's surplus number is 162 billion. The number that we arrive at is 71. Then when you look at buyout, the TPR number is 97 billion surplus of schemes in surplus, and 38 billion is our number. It's probably worth going back and reading the blog that we wrote for Henry on Monday. It's on the web, I'm sure. But net, the numbers being advanced here are far, far smaller than we are led to believe, and they are probably insufficient in size to have any material impact on the US economy. Anyway, though you asked for a few more, there you are.
Brilliant. Well, thank you. And, important points. If you do even just tweak the assumptions that you're using in calculating these numbers, if you change your longevity assumptions, if interest rates change, then suddenly they can look quite different as well. So that is definitely worth being aware of. So if we talk a little bit about how surpluses could be used, and of course we can debate about what the exact number that surplus is valued is. I think there are lots of different stakeholders who feel that they should have a slice of the surplus pie. And I think your decision on where you would allocate surplus to probably depends on what your overall goals are. Are you is your main goal to improve UK GDP? Is it to improve productive finance investment? Is it to improve retirement outcomes? Are you just trying to do whatever the most fair thing is? The decision you make on where surplus should be spent would probably depend on sort of what your priorities are. But I think we also have to start with we have to start by talking about the existing DB members, because this is who these pension schemes have been set up for. And, if I'm being totally honest, I'm part of Generation DC. I often sort of feel jealous of the fact that DB members, like my parents, are so much better off than me when it comes to their pension. They get this guaranteed income for life where their employers is the one bearing all the risk. But, DB members were promised this pension. They did work hard. They agreed job packages with the knowledge that at the end of it, they'd get a good DB pension. And also because we've had this sort of period of high inflation where caps that exist within pension benefits mean that, pensioners haven't always had benefits that track that high level of inflation. Many of them have lost out on money in real terms as well. So I think there's a good argument for kind of some of that surplus going to DB members, the ones of the schemes already. And there's also, from that sort of productive finance and growth angle, an argument that, if they have more money in their pockets, they'll spend it in the real economy, and that's good for GDP. There's the sponsor. So many sponsors have paid plenty of money into the pension schemes over time. And it's kind of fair that they might want something back, to see it as a potential asset. And again, if we're taking this sort of broader productive finance lens, to sort of what the decision should be, there's this idea that if the sponsor is a business that's good for the economy, it's providing something that we need as a society, then giving that sponsor some more money to reinvest in their business, in research and development, that could be good for overall GDP as well. And if that business is also doing something that's good for society, that's good for the planet, then again there's an additional benefit from that. A couple of other comments I've just seen come through. TPR liabilities also based on the volatile gilt yield. Yeah, exactly. Depending on what's going on with yields, things can be all over the place. Will we see a slowdown of buyout? We definitely will come on to that because it's a very important question. And might those in DC Master Trust open up a DC section for active? Is that meant to be a DB section for active? But some interesting comments on here as well around numbers as well. So that's kind of the obvious place of where money might go is probably your DB members and the sponsors of the DB scheme. But I think we should also talk about DC members as part of all of this, because I do often find it a little bit bizarre that we spend sort of so much time looking at how we can gold plate or even diamond plate DB pensions and protect DB members as much as possible. But then you have DC members where they're taking all the risk. They often have too low levels of contributions. They're often navigating other financial pressures. And in fact, research from the PLSA suggests that 62% of households currently saving into a DB pension will not achieve their retirement income target. And these are dynamics that are often exacerbated for marginalized communities. So I do think there's like a real potential sort of adequacy crisis looming that we need to address as well. And where trustees, look after a scheme that has both DB and DC sections, they do need to make sure that they're fulfilling their duties to both sets of members, to their DB members and their DC members. So I think we should just think a little bit about, does it make sense if you have one bucket of members that are sitting with a surplus of money, not knowing what to do with it, and then another bucket of members that are projected to not really be able to survive financially in retirement? There are ways that you can sort of do some of this sharing already. If you have a DB and DC scheme in the same trust, you can sort of set up systems to use some of your DB surplus to pay additional DC benefits. But I think in the context of the wider pensions environment, with this move to DC consolidation, we may need to sort of take a different approach and think about this more holistically. I can see there's a hand up. Was that on purpose?
Bobby. Go on, Bobby.
Yes.
Yeah, in respect of DC being used for surplus, I've only ever seen so far the surplus being used to pay the employer's contributions for DC. So I haven't yet seen a scenario where they've increased the DC members' benefits.
Yeah, I agree. That's mainly what I've seen so far as well. And, if that employer is really struggling and needs the money, I can kind of see some benefit to that. But you're right, it's not addressing the adequacy issue. It's not improving the retirement projections by doing that. So I do wonder, if we see some introduction of rules on how surplus can be used, will there be something around it needs to improve those outcomes overall to DC members rather than just changing where that money's coming from? I think there's another hand up.
I'm sorry, can I challenge that? The one I'm talking about is that if your DC is with a master trust and you've got a DB pension, the sponsor could actually reopen a new section within the scheme for DC. Leave the master trust with the deferreds, and basically take the contributions, the surpluses, as contributions into the DC section for the active members.
I mean, that is something you could do under the current rules, yeah. So perhaps that's something we'll see more of. Because,
yeah, but I'm just saying that those sponsors who basically completely gave up and just went to a master trust might actually reverse it the other way round and make the use of those surpluses into their own new DC section.
Yeah, I think especially, I guess they'll have to think about kind of what are the costs of running their own section and what's the governance burden of that. Definitely something we might see happen. Is there another hand up?
Yeah, Peter. Peter, do you want to unmute, Peter?
Yes, thank you very much. Just picking up on that point, the problem is that if you, in the DB section with the surplus, you have pooled assets available for all the members. If you open another section, a DC section within the scheme or outside the scheme, you're actually transferring money out of the pooled asset pool, the pooled asset pool, that's tautological, into individual DC accounts. So in fact, it is almost exactly the same as distributing that surplus, but instead of distributing it to the employer, you're distributing it to the future employees of the organisation. So I suspect under the principles of equity, any trust deed that seeks to permit that would fall foul of the sort of Virgin Media type scenario, that the benefits of the existing members are being put at risk, and it will have to be decided on the same basis as surplus distribution to the employer.
That's a really useful insight. Thank you. I think that's it for the hands up so far, so I'll just carry on, but please do continue chipping in. It's really helpful. I think the other obvious sort of party that might want a slice of the pie is the government itself. You know, pension schemes do get fairly favourable tax treatment, and the government also does need money to provide the service that the country needs, which includes UK pension scheme members. There's also perhaps more incentive for them to legislate for change if they can get some of this as well. So I think there's a possibility that government might want sort of a slice of this pie too. And I think it's really good that we sort of have this debate about where surplus goes, what's the fairest, what's the most productive way of doing it. But I guess an important point is that having some money to split out is probably better than not having any money at all. So having an environment where you can grow surpluses in a safe way and split them out isn't, you know, necessarily a bad thing in itself. Because the other important thing about sort of having this regime where you can access surpluses is that it may impact the way that you invest. You know, you may invest in a way that generates more surpluses. This is a chart from the Purple Book that just shows the way that kind of DB investment strategies have changed over time. They have very much trended away from equity investments into bond investments. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, it's a good thing because it reflects improved funding level. And I think an important thing to note is that a lot of that yellow bar, the bonds bar, is held in gilt. So from the UK government perspective, you know, they are benefiting from these strategies still because they're getting, that's how they're raising a lot of their lending. But I do sort of have some questions on a systemic level, if it makes sense for all sort of such a big pool of assets to be invested in such a concentrated way. You know, is that the most efficient way to invest a portfolio? Would you be able to take on a little bit more sort of diversified risk and boost your returns? Another big thing we have to think about is liquidity as well. You know, one of the reasons that DB schemes hold these strategies is because many of them are planning to go to an insurer or want to keep that option open. And, you know, there's a big question about if there is incentives to run on for longer and access surplus, would insurance still look as attractive as it currently does? Another thing that's really important to me specifically is the fact that if you have a regime where you can generate a bit more returns, where you do take a longer term view, where you can have some more illiquidity in there, you may be more likely to invest in kind of impactful investments, you know, ones that aim to deliver a social and environmental good, as well as those strong diversified financial returns. So that's a little bit about kind of how the changes to the regime could affect the way that we're actually invested. I think the bit we really have to talk about is how we make sure that existing members are protected, because I think the worst situation we could end up in is one where kind of DB schemes end up taking too much risk because of it. You know, they get greedy and then suddenly they become underfunded and they're unable to pay their members' benefits. And I think trustees of DB schemes are very aware of this risk, and they're conscious of making sure that they're still able to fulfill their duty of protecting their members' benefits. But I think there are ways that we can address this. So one idea is, which my former colleagues at LCP have done a lot of work on, is thinking about the role of the PPF and whether they could provide extra security and reassurance to trustees. You could also perhaps have a strategy where, you know, you have a certain investment strategy for your core assets up to your up to being 100% funded, and then the assets in a surplus have a different investment strategy. Maybe the mindset around how we think about risk could affect things as well. You know, are you going to reduce your covenant risk by passing some of your surplus onto your sponsor? Are you going to reduce other sort of systemic risks by encouraging a more growthy environment in the UK? And I think the other thing that's important to think about when we're protecting members is just that we're protecting all members, you know, DB and DC members. So I just wanted to finish off by talking about kind of how all this discussion on DB surplus fits into the sort of broader pensions and policy landscape, because a big topic of discussion outside of DB in the LGPS and the DC world is consolidation. But in DB, kind of feels like the mood music is going the opposite way, because the main way that DB pension schemes are currently consolidated is via insurers. And the kind of motivation from government for why LGPS and DC should consolidate is because there's this idea that there'll be larger, more sophisticated asset owners that are more likely to then invest in kind of UK growth. But obviously, if DB schemes are running on, then they're not consolidating as much, whether that's with insurers or a super fund, or I guess in the case of distressed schemes, the PPF. So, you know, they're not getting that consolidation that they're pushing for in other areas. Of course, with insurers, unlike with kind of pooled LGPS and master trust, there are quite a lot of regulatory restrictions to what they can hold, and perhaps the UK government feels that that's going to be against their productive finance agenda, or the fact that insurers tend to hold less gilt might be a concern as well. But, you know, I do think that this could really change what the landscape looks like in terms of end game for pension schemes. I still think insurance will be the right decision for some, but it might be that they decide to do this a bit later on than they currently had decided to. And I think it's also important that we think about how this all fits in with the broader, you know, government agenda outside of pensions. One thing we keep hearing from Rachel Reeves is about growth. You know, the UK wants growth, but it's important that we remember why it wants growth in the first place, because it's not just about kind of growing GDP for the sake of a number in a chart. It's about actually having that money to improve the quality of life for people in the UK, you know, having the money to invest in healthcare and education and other pillars of our society. And I think that's similar with kind of the government's net zero targets and clean energy goals. It's all about improving outcomes for people, because we know that climate change is likely to be, you know, devastating financially and in terms of quality of life for people if it's unmitigated. So I think as part of all this, we should also think about how we, you know, think carefully about the way that we're investing pensions, so that we're also helping to meet those wider goals of improving outcomes in society. And I think impact investments can be a really good way to do this while still getting kind of strong financial returns. So that's the end of my slides. I'm going to take them off now so we can see each other. It looks like there's been some more chat coming through in the comments. So it would be good to sort of talk through some of that and hear different views and questions and thoughts from the audience.
Yeah, thanks, Lasha. That's a really good presentation. Really sort of a good overview of what's going on. I don't know, Con, whether you want to unmute, or Anthony's done a few comments in the chat. But Anthony, do you want to go first, maybe, and tell us what you think? If you can hear us, that is, Anthony.
Yeah, sure. Well, I suppose we're compounding multiple questions here. I mean, I take a view that all pension schemes are in surplus, even if you're supposedly only about 80–90% funded. You know, you just have to be able to run them off for long enough. And, you know, when I started my career, I was still sort of advising pension funds where the sponsor had sort of failed 15–20 years, and those pension schemes were able to keep going on a self-sufficiency basis in their definition of it, without the need to buy out and that. And we forget that buyout is a relatively recent alternative. End game was not always the case. So I think we can sort of agree that there probably is surplus in pension schemes, you know, even if we can't agree the quantum of it. The second stage is then who owns it. And I sort of struggle a bit here because, you know, the clues in the word defined benefit, you know, people were agreed to a particular benefit. They were quite happy to have that. And, you know, even where the sponsor, although irrevocably sort of has a sort of lender of last resort balance of cost, it doesn't seem to sort of work in a negative contribution way. And, you know, and you should all, in theory, be able to unwind it. But because of the sort of moral hazard of where the sponsor has to seek TPR approval and write out to members, even if they've got a legal unilateral right, they never get the surplus. Now, we might be approving the tax efficiency of it in terms of the withdrawal of it, so that makes it more interesting. But, you know, I think defined benefit members, yes, they may sort of complain that as individuals today, they haven't got enough income and therefore they should be entitled to more. But I mean, that's not unique to DB pensioners. It's not, you know, it applies to everyone, you know, and so everybody wants, you know, a share of what's left over. So, you know, I mean, simplistically, I would, you know, be reversing it back out to the sponsor at the same rate that they were, you know, they had relief to put it back in. And if government then wants to impose taxes on those sponsors or provide other fiscal or non-fiscal incentives for them to distribute the funds, then that's probably an easier way of doing it than trying to corral pension schemes into behaving into a particular fashion.
Thank you. Very useful insights, and I do wonder how every pension scheme will feel, the DB pension schemes, if they hear that they're all in a surplus. But you know, it's definitely an interesting perspective. I mean, do you think that trustees would feel comfortable with that approach? And I guess I'm thinking particularly about some of those really, you know, unionized DB pension schemes. There could be all sorts of sort of issues there.
I think they possibly get, I mean, you know, the role of fiduciary is to ensure that the members get the benefits that they were promised. It's not to ensure that there is, you know, an excess, a surplus. Mm-hmm. You know, they have an obligation to try and recover the funding and make sure the company pays what it is due. You know, arguably they also have a sort of a responsibility. They shouldn't overcharge the sponsor either. And, you know, in funding negotiations, and I've sat both sides of the fence, you know, trustees have been sort of open to the appeal of a sponsor that says, look, you know, we ultimately did for the money, you know, it would help us if we didn't front end the contributions and we just see how experience plays out. Yes, you've always got that risk that your sponsor might fail, and, you know, large companies do fail as much as small ones. And that, so, you know, you don't want to sort of keep on pushing it out, but, you know, we've sort of gone a long way from the days of sort of holistic funding and having a realistic view of it, and we've almost gone back to a sort of as continental Europe. Here's a funding basis. Someone has defined it as being low risk, and you anchor on that for fear that, you know, you'll be challenged for having any form of judgment.
Okay, Anthony, thanks for that. Lasha, do you want to respond to that, or should we go to Peter?
I think we can go to Peter. Yeah.
Okay,
thanks,
Peter,
Anthony.
do you want to? Thanks for your question, Anthony. Peter, what point do you want to make?
Yeah, I think I should say at the outset, I am a documented advocate of reopening DB benefits in pension schemes because that solves an awful lot of problems. The problems that we may have not correctly ascertained the true cost of the actual pension promise in the past. Now that's debatable. In my own scheme, we set a contribution rate in 2003 that when we looked at in 2024, we came up with almost exactly the same figure. But in the meantime, it has gone all over the place, if you like. That sends some doubts. The major determinant of the cost of the pension are the fundamental pension promise. And I suggest that employers should actually look at that and say, what are we prepared to fund in terms of defined benefit? And that may be an 80th, or it may be as low as 120th, which is the minimum funding rate for auto enrolment on an average salary scheme, with minimum rate increases and discretionary benefits, so they can not provide an increase in any particular year of stress. Now the other determinant is the investment performance of the scheme, which is what we've been talking about this morning. And if you're adjusting your investment performance to an estimate of cost based on a highly volatile, in fact, the most volatile investment return that schemes have and can get from their assets, namely the gilt yields, then you are embedding the distortions of that volatility into your costing analysis. If you're running on a pooled fund, then you have the opportunity to use both the employers and the employees' contributions to be invested to address any past over or underestimation of cost. And now if you then think about that and say, well, we've got that flexibility, what should we fund? You then look at what it would cost to fund those benefits on a DC basis. And with your former employer's LCP analysis, they suggest that it should be between 20 or 50% increased cost in a DC arrangement than over a DB or a CDC arrangement, is what we're looking at, because of the pooled nature of the fund. The one fundamental difference that distorts things is that DB benefits are deferred remuneration for the life of the employee and the dependents defined in the scheme deed, and there are no question of it providing wealth beyond death, if you like. So that is probably one of the things that employees perhaps make them reluctant to think about DB benefits as beneficial. But with the inheritance tax rules, I think it's looking better. So those are my rants, my observations. I have put in submissions to the consultation, both the April last year one and indeed subsequently to DWP, pointing these things out and suggesting that they should be encouraging schemes to think about the cost of the promise and the cost of that pension promise and achieve that in the most efficient way. And that would result in an investment policy that perhaps met the government's objectives. There we are. That's the end of my lecture. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Those are really useful insights. And I'd be very happy if I suddenly got to be a DB member and have a DB pension. So maybe we'll see that. Maybe we'll see CDC becoming more popular. I think you raised an interesting point about kind of gilts as well, and are they the most appropriate, asset to use as your discount rate? So lots and lots of food for thought there. Thank you.
By the way, that's on Henry's blog this morning. I've put in a comment there about gilts. Secondly, I just should say I'm sitting here with a pension scheme that's set up, I said, about 2003. We're running as an open scheme. We are now got, under technical provisions, an over 200% funding rate.
Wow.
Which is point and surplus, and we're having discussions. The employer doesn't really want any surplus back, so that slightly changed our view about distribution of that. Yes, these members and employer and risk, what we should retain as a risk buffer, but there we go.
Wow, that must be an interesting position to be in.
Congratulations, Peter. You're one of the few, maybe, but well done. Con, you got your hand raised, and then we might talk to one or two trustees because I want to get the trustees' perspective on this as well. But yeah, Con, you go first, and we'll bring in one of the trustees that's on the call.
All right, let me put the cat really among the pigeons here. The objective of government is to get pension scheme assets of all shape and form invested in UK productive assets. Now, it's not just about dealing with surpluses. It's much broader, the objective that they want, and to make a material impact on the UK economy, you really do need to be talking about the totality of assets, not the marginal differences. Now, here comes the cat among the pigeons. From the trustees I have spoken to, and there have been a lot in the course of the last year, I don't believe that the appetite is there for schemes to invest in the way which government is promoting, for many reasons, quite a few of which are, I think, perfectly valid. Now, it seems to me that the only way in which government can assure investment within the UK productive economy is to reintroduce exchange controls. So that's one to go away and think about. Sorry, for those of you who don't remember exchange controls, basically it requires you to pay a premium to invest overseas, which means you tend to keep your money at home.
Interesting.
So change the tax treatment, Con, basically, so that more
No,
is
it's not
invested in the UK.
No. It's much more onerous than that. To make overseas investments, you have to buy overseas currency and you have to buy it at a premium. At one point when I was trading dollar premium, it was trading at over 100%. So where the official rate of the US dollar might have been 2.4 to 1 or 2 to 1, the actual exchange rate you were able to achieve was 1 to 1.
Wow.
Ouch.
Yes, ouch is a good one.
I mean,
and,
it went down to 10-20% shortly before Maggie Thatcher removed it, but it kept money at home, and that was its purpose.
yeah,
Not a bad idea. Lashia, what do you think?
I think it's an appalling idea, but don't be surprised if government comes up with it.
I think when you when you just think about how you would construct a portfolio, the idea of not being able to access global diversification or overseas investments feels a bit worrying, and it's the same when you talk about whether the UK will just mandate that that pension schemes have to have a certain amount invested in the UK. Is that really? I'd rather they do things to make those investments themselves more attractive. So, for example, giving the underlying companies, the kind of regulatory environment, or the encouragement they need, so that those companies themselves will perform better, making the UK more financially attractive, rather than kind of these other more penalizing approaches. But it's certainly an interesting thing. It's certainly an interesting topic to reflect on and to explore a bit more.
Thanks, Lashia. We've got a few trustees on today. I don't know, Bobby, do you want to go first? And what's the trustees' perspective on this? What do you think are the better options for looking after the members?
So, first of all, trustees have over the years been told to get as much money into the schemes as possible and make the benefits as secure as possible. So you're going to have to change the trustees' mindsets. I don't know whether that'll be easy with professional trustees or with lay trustees. I'm not sure, because I think they've both been set down the same way by the regulators. And I think for this to work, you need to be pragmatic, proportional, and to be able to have grown-up conversations with not just the sponsor, but also the regulator, and get some clear steers from the regulator. Because I've been in insurance and investments and trusteeship now for 30 years, and the one thing that always comes back to bite you is hindsight. And so any decisions that need to be made very openly and very clearly and documented very clearly. So that's just that's my first point. If it was just a case of returning surplus to the employer, I think we need a bit more than the government just making it practically easier. We need some permission and then grown-up conversations. Secondly, when a trustee is going to get the time to discuss surplus, how high up the agenda is this if it's not being pushed by the employer? We've got the ESOG. They're having to go through all their corporate governance codes. We've got dashboards going live this year. We've also got the fact that the one thing I'm pushing is climate isn't getting any better. A lot of schemes have got a long way to go to even start making moves to make their investments sustainable. This just is not the top of the pension schemes trustees agenda. Even if we get it to the top of the agenda, even if we get permission to give the surplus back to the employer, is the employer going to invest it in the UK? Probably invest it in the business. A lot of pension schemes are sponsors are not UK sponsors. If the pension scheme gets to keep the money in some form or other, then all the arguments that have already been said apply. Why in the UK? So I think there's potential to get some of the surplus out of the schemes, but a lot needs to change and it needs to get high enough up the agenda. And I just don't think this will be the main thing that trustees will be spending 2025 looking at.
That's a really useful perspective. Also, I love this idea of having grown-up conversations because it's making me wonder how many childish conversations are currently happening.
There's one other point I just wanted to make, which I don't know how many people are aware of this. The new funding code requires schemes to increase their liabilities for the expenses of running the scheme to the to the date of maturity. So for the scheme that I currently am the chair of, over the next 3 years we close our deficit by contributions, and then in 3 years' time with the new funding code we have to put in an expense reserve which is equal to the deficit we currently got, so it opens back up again. And it's basically for schemes, any schemes below 100 million, it's a significant, you calculate 10 years of 15 years worth of expenses. That is a significant hit on the liabilities, and it just goes in as a liability. It just increases the liability. So that's, I don't think anybody's talking about, and the amount of surplus that's going to eat up.
So it might not be as big as everybody thinks.
I think the government's gone for the most optimistic figure, really, and then to get anywhere near that, it's just a bit of a pipe dream in my view.
Okay, we've got Bryn on the call. Bryn, is there any inside track you can give us on your thoughts on this, and then we'll come to some others. But yeah, Bryn, what do you want to say?
I don't really have an inside track, but I have been here before, in a rather different world, of course. The short version is it was before finance directors got really interested in pensions, but there was a whole process of surpluses back in the late 80s, early 90s, where I was sort of in the thick of it, from different perspectives. And of course, the easiest way, what's open to every DB scheme, is to tackle a surplus by adjusting the contributions. And the employer pays less. And there were cases, and this is an important qualification, there were cases where the members' contributions were adjusted. There were really two worlds. There were employers who didn't have recognised trade unions and employers where there were recognised trade unions. And in the latter case, which is the ones where I was involved, there was usually a deal to be made, and the members got something and the employer got something that even include down to specifically benefit improvements and refunds to the employer. it went on. Well, there weren't any unions. You generally just got refunds to the employer. I agree with Con that we don't really know what the surpluses are. I think the government haven't quite got clear in their minds that they've fastened on this idea that money could be refunded to employers, and as long as it's over the sort of whatever's defined as an ongoing basis, that money goes to the employer, and the employer will invest it in growing the economy. Well, there's a lot of assumptions built in there. What pension funds really should be doing, or what they've failed to do over the last 15, 20 years, is themselves invest in growing the economy. And that I think would be a far better way of tackling it, sort of go for risk-on investments of some sort rather than just buying masses gilt. I think it's a big problem for the government in their approach if they think that if there's these assets that can be used productively, if they're refunded to employers, well, pension funds will have to get that cash to pay employers by selling gilts. And I don't think the government are quite focused on the implications of that. So I think it's all problematic. We're going to be discussing it, I assume, when the pensions bill comes out. I'm sure there'll be lots of debate. I will do my best to try and explain realities.
Thanks, Brian. Yeah, that's it's going to be an interesting year, isn't it? I think on many fronts. So that's really good. William, apologies, you come in fairly late, but I know you're a fan of DB schemes and running on and that sort of stuff. Do you want to unmute William and tell us your thoughts on DB surplus announcement? What do you think, William? Putting you on the spot. If you can hear me, that is. I don't know if you can or can't. You need to unmute, William. Can you unmute?
Okay. Is that better?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay, yeah. No, I think it's a very interesting position. I think that what the government need to do, and perhaps we all need to look at, is fiduciary duty, which I think is a blocker for a lot of the trustees. I think as Bobby was getting at, and I think they can do. I think you can do something about fiduciary duty by tweaking some of the rules on investment, maybe linking into what you can do in investment into the UK, maybe by tweaking the PPF. But you need to move ground so that the trustees, who currently can just veto any change in strategy, really by just saying it's not in accordance with their fiduciary duty. If you can tweak that, then I think you may get a bit of moving up the agenda. And I think there is scope, not so much really, I think, about the surpluses. I think it's about the investment strategy. I think that's a point, obviously, Con obviously focused on. If you can just get people to move the investment strategy from targeting, and this is where the regulator could make a difference, let's say targeting gilts 50 or gilts 30 to targeting gilts 150, that has a lot of ramifications and a lot of reinvestment opportunities over a long period of time. So I think I'm not as I think the government is really onto something here. They've been working at it for a while. I've been talking to various folk about it for a while. I think the government is determined, and there will be a serious effort put into making some of this money in DB schemes work harder. And I think don't get entirely sidelined about the surpluses. Surpluses can help for DB and DC. DB to DC is great and should be taking place. But really the big story is, can you get more of that money put into productive assets? And if the government want to do it and get it in the UK, then they have to give a straight incentive, which they can easily do through the tax system, to make it attractive to trustees to invest a proportion of their money in the UK. So I think it needs all the parties to sit down, understand the red lines of the other parties involved, and produce a better answer. And I don't think it takes years. To be honest, I think I think all the pre-prep's been done, and it's really now, and I'm hopeful that when the government come out with some ideas around here, they don't just let it be a surplus free-for-all for corporates, but they do expect more of the trustees to chip in and help in the growth story.
And William, what do you think about this point around if more pension assets are being used for productive finance? And there's probably a whole other one of these sessions we can do on what that means. What does that mean for gilt investment? Who's going to sort of buy the gilts instead of DB pension schemes? Well,
I think again at the moment it's one of those strange things, and Con's pretty good on this. Is a lot if money goes to more money, as it happens at the moment, merrily goes off to the life insurers. The life insurers aren't normally buying the gilts anyway; they're buying the corporate bonds. So I don't think it's a massive problem for the government in terms of oh golly gosh, a few schemes are starting to just tweak and over time evolve their investment strategy to make it a little bit more productive. And I think they need it. They need it to get the city going. There's so many easy targets, so many benefits of knuckling down and just seeing what you can do with 1.2 or was it whatever it is. Cons obviously great work here. What is the number? Let's focus on the investment strategy, and if there's money coming out of the system that can go into surpluses that could be used to fund other things, that is great too. And I just go back, 10% increase for members shouldn't be forgotten here. 10% increase on a discretionary basis, that's 5 billion into the economy a year. Come on, we could do this.
Brilliant.
Okay, William, thank you very much. Con, over to you. We've got a few minutes left, but yeah, what's your point?
I'll just add a comment on who buys the gilts. If you manage to invest the 1.25 trillion of DB plus the 0.5 trillion of LGPS funds, plus the what will be about 0.5 trillion of DC productively, then gilt funding is in fact self-fulfilling. The fact that the economy is growing and so on is producing more tax revenues, and the gilt financing problem goes away. The attraction of that is once you have that form of fiscal position, the attractions of the UK to foreigners are manifest. If you do it in sufficient scale, it is self-fulfilling. You do not have a problem of financing government debt.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. Thank you.
Cheers, Con. Thanks very much. Anthony, you put a comment in the chat regarding this has actually happened in the past, and unions were happy. Is that something you just want to maybe finish on a high note, Anthony? Yeah. Do you want to explain your model there? Did that actually work? Did it, presumably?
It did, and so I mean, again, the cost of funding the pension scheme, particularly when we were looking at very low interest rates, was very challenging. But we looked at the individual assumptions and realised that one of the biggest problems was that we were assuming full RPI pension increases didn't actually reflect what we were paying as salary increases. So we were over assuming within the pension scheme as to what the future payroll was going to be. So the way we did it was we said, look, we'll just cap rather than close the scheme, which weirdly would have had a disadvantageous effect because a revaluation of defers was again at a faster rate than the pension payroll increases. We sort of said, right, we'll cap the future increase at 1% defers of DB, but we'll make the whole pension pay still pensionable, albeit through a hybrid DC arrangement. And for the unions, and we had the communication workers because of our sort of legacy alliance, Gyrobank and Alliance and Leicester history, thought this was great because we were keeping the plan open for their members. They were very supportive. Ironically, the biggest compliment we actually had was from Lloyds Bank's union letter demanding that Lloyds followed a similar approach rather than close the scheme, which certainly the Santander executive at the time loved getting plaudits from Lloyds members. The other thing I would finish on, though, is it's quite interesting that we've just had a debate on gilts, and we have to remember what is a gilt. Well, gilt is an instrument where we are getting the government that is going to promise to pay me a sum so I can promise to pay my pension. So I come back to my tongue-in-cheek thing. Let's give all the assets and liabilities gap to the government rather than complicate it with these gilt ideas. If we're relying on them to pay me to pay our pensions, why do I need the middleman?
And on that bombshell,
yes, ending on let's nationalise pensions. Love it. Not controversial at all. Brilliant.
Yeah, thank you very much, Anthony. That's great. Lascia, thank you very much indeed for your presentation and opening up the wide debate and discussion. This is not going to go away. We'll probably have another session, I guess, in the next few months to see how things go. But thanks everybody for joining. I'm sure we got lots of virtual claps. Thanks, Peter, for the claps, and I'm sure you'll all thank me and join me with wishing Lascia all the best. And thank you very much for your presentation. It's really, really good. As usual, the video for this will be up on the site this afternoon. If we can get the website working, that would be useful. So that video will be up with a podcast for those that go to the gym. And next week we have a presentation from Hyman. So I'll keep everybody informed as to what next week's delicious coffee morning will be next week. And as usual, we pay for Peace in the East, and I also wish Henry Tapper continued recovery from his accident. So thanks everyone for joining. Enjoy the rest of your day, enjoy the rest of your week, and Lascia, thank you very much indeed. Really appreciate it.
Thanks all. Bye.
Thanks a lot. Take care. Bye. Cheers. Bye.